All right, for more budget reaction, we are joined by the ACT leader, David Seymour. David, first up, what's your pithy little name for this budget? Because everyone has one.
Well, it's the brain drain budget. It needed to give young people in particular hope that New Zealand incomes will grow, that the cost of living will be brought under control, and that there's some strategy to do things differently, because especially after the last 2 years, a lot of people in New Zealand just given up hope and thinking of leaving. It needed to give them hope, and really all it's done is it said we're going to not only keep spending at the same rate, but find more wacky and wonderful things to spend on, and that's why we called it the brain drain budget.
Okay, isn't there $100 million in there for business to look into tech advancement and get more highly qualified people in tech?
Oh, sure. Now let's think about that for a moment. There's no shortage of people looking for a good investment, and there's no shortage of businesses out there looking for capital. The challenge is for people to find each other. If anyone really thinks the government taking $100 million off you in taxes and then telling you effectively where that money should be invested by choosing themselves is going to solve that fundamental problem, then I think you're dreaming. They've got nothing to add in terms of knowledge or value when it comes to investing money in businesses. So again, it'll provide good photo ops for politicians. It won't actually raise New Zealand's productivity, which in the last few years has fallen behind the Czech Republic, Slovenia and Lithuania. That's why I say there needed to be hope. We are gradually declining relative to even former communist countries. We need to actually have a bit of a reset. That's why ACT produced an alternative budget that would have given you that reset, but unfortunately, Grant has just chosen to carry on as a very conservative.
Hang on though, David. Spending is forecast in this budget to grow slower than the economy is forecast to grow, right? So I wouldn't say that is a profligate strategy.
Well, we just ran a $20 billion deficit. The idea that we should try and spend faster than the economy's growing would be madness. But I would make the comparison to other countries. So look at the next year, and as a percentage of GDP, we're forecast to spend 30.5%, so almost a third of all dollars in the economy taken and spent by government. In Australia, it's 28. So basically, if you're in Australia, the government takes 2.5% less every year. And over time, that adds up to a big advantage for being there rather than here. And that's why I'm concerned that as the wage gap grows, and the wage gap with Australia has grown $6,600 a year under Labor, you're going to see people leave. And we can't afford to train people for export. It's very expensive to do. We need skills and capital here, but there's nothing in this budget that's designed to attract it to New Zealand.
Okay, well, what's not to like about more money in health? For Pharmac, for dental care, for those at the bottom of the pile? Surely those are good, popular, and I don't know, empathetic policies.
Well, let's take Pharmac. There's no question that we have been at the bottom of the list of developed countries for the number of drugs we fund. As a politician, you see people coming to the steps of Parliament just about every other week saying, myself or my relative, my friend, they need this drug. It could save their life. It's funded in Australia. It's not funded here. So that's a major problem. They said they'll spend an extra $191 million through Pharmac over 2 years. That's great. But here's the question. In what world do you have to wait for a budget with Grant Robertson saying just 2 more sleeps to find out if a drug will be funded and you live or die? Brooke Van Velden, our deputy leader, has been driving the government to have a Pharmac reviewer. She succeeded in making them have one, but they haven't included funding in it. I think we've got to ask, are we doing Pharmac funding the right way 30 years on from when it was first established in 1993? But secondly, if we don't work on productivity and our incomes in general, then our ability to afford the things that we need, including pharmaceuticals, under any Pharmac funding formula, is going to be less than the countries we like comparing ourselves with. So, yep, good on them, Pharmac, but we wouldn't do it that way, and they don't have a long-term solution to it either.
We've had Eric Crampton from the New Zealand Initiative on this morning. He says, why didn't they just address bracket creep in the income tax regime instead of throwing this $350 over 2 months out to everyone under 70. He also said it's crazy extending a subsidy to drive a petrol car instead of just distributing the carbon dividend to New Zealanders through tax relief. And I think he asked some pretty good fundamental questions that this looks like, and it's been called the Band-Aid budget. I've called it the Panadol budget. It might take the edge off the headache, but it's not going to cure the underlying condition, is it?
Well, if you take that carbon tax refund, that's a policy in our alternative budget. So we would take a couple of $1 billion a year raised through the ETS and give it back in a per citizen amount of about $200. It varies a bit depending on the carbon price each year. I think if you did that, then you'd actually get some buy-in in the ETS, because people would see that, if you spend less on carbon, then you get to keep more of that extra money. If you spend more fueling up the V8, then it'll cost you. But that would be by far the least bureaucratic and the most consumer-friendly way to have a climate policy. If you believe we should have one, that's the way to do it. When he talks about the bracket creep, I think that's a mistake. We don't want to keep adjusting the parameters of a tax system that has 6 different tax rates. We want lower, flatter taxes. So again, you look at ACT's alternative budget, we showed how you could go from 6 different rates of income tax down to just 2 rates, 17.5 and 28. And that would have given a lot of money back, or allowed people to keep a lot more money. Someone on 70 grand would be $2,300 a year better off under ACT's alternative budget. But instead of just adjusting the Labour Party system, we would have actually introduced a low, flat, simple tax system. And the important thing about it in the long term is the values. Right now, with 6 different tax rates, what we're really saying is, for every extra effort you make, we will have a tax rate to take a little bit more off you. That is tall poppy syndrome in the tax code. If we want to be competitive and become a wealthy country again, then we actually need to rethink the way that we do tax. A lower, flatter, simpler, more effective and efficient system with just 2 tax rates would be far better than what this government has proposed, which is to have 6 different tax rates, or what Eric Crampton or frankly the National Party proposed, which is to carry on the way we are but tweak the numbers a little bit every now and then.
Yeah. The other thing, of course, is a budget is often an aspirational document. Do you think we are going to be back into surplus? What is it, 24, 25? Do you think we are going to control spending? Do you think the predictions are reasonable and achievable?
Well, no, I don't. And the reason I don't think they're reasonable and achievable is that if you look at the underlying data in the budget documents released yesterday, they're basically an update on Treasury's forecast from December. Now, in just 6 months, the forecasts have all gotten worse. Interest on debt, just the interest on debt, is 1.7 billion higher than forecast in December. Our peak debt is now $15 billion higher than forecast in December. Inflation for next year, in December they thought next year's inflation would be 3%. They're now predicting 5.2%, so we're going to see the cost of living crisis roll into next year. And as for getting to surplus, that was supposed to be 2024. They've now said 2025. What we're seeing repeatedly is that everything they thought was going to happen even 6 months ago has got worse. I'm afraid to say, I think the way that Labor behaves, and with very damaging legislation such as fair pay agreements and the effects of this emissions reduction plan, what we will see is the situation deteriorate even further beyond these forecasts. So I don't want to be the pessimist, Sean, but people need to realise it's that bad. We're just going down the pathway.
Is there anything you like in this budget, David? There must be something you think is a good idea. I don't know, dental care for the poor.
What they've done, and this is not a spending initiative, but they've actually introduced legislation to stop supermarkets putting covenants on land to stop other supermarkets being built on land that they once owned or were beside. Now, I think that that's an anti-competitive practice. The Australians got rid of it. Competition Commission got rid of it in 2009. the Commerce Commission in New Zealand is either incompetent or ignorant and hasn't done anything about that since. So look, that's a positive thing. If it gets a bit more competition in the supermarket industry, good on them.
That's the only thing you like about the budget?
Pretty difficult to see anything else, Sean. I mean, we have a country that is falling behind in productivity, is now poorer than former communist countries that have overtaken us. We have huge deficits. We have a cost of living crisis with inflation that's now forecast to carry on at over 5% into next year. I'd love to be able to say more positive things, Sean, but I just think the only positive thing in the budget was ACT's alternative budget would have actually given us a chance to turn some of these trends around, but they are just ambling on towards the cliff. And
as an individual, is there anything in this for you? Apart from some political gain, you would imagine?
I beg your pardon?
Is there anything in this apart from you as an individual and your household budget, your single man household budget? You get cheaper gas, but I don't imagine... Do you have a car?
Yeah, I do. And I mean, everyone's looking at petrol prices. You look at this 25 cents. They took it off hoping that the war would be over and the oil price would go back down. And they'd get off scot-free. But of course, the oil price has stayed high. The sanctions on the Russians have gone tougher. And as a result, they now have a policy they can't reverse. As Milton Friedman used to say, there is nothing more permanent than a temporary government policy.
Right. Hey, in Parliament, what happens with the budget now? Is it all done and dusted, or do you have endless, boring debates about the detail of the budget for the next wee while?
Well, one of the things that governments often do after a budget is they introduce a bunch of other legislation that they wanted to pass and they ram it through under urgency, sort of under cover of the budget. So there's actually 6 pieces of legislation. I suspect MPs will be debating them continuously well into Saturday morning, so we'll be under urgency for a while.
You lucky thing. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to us today. That is David Seymour, leader of the ACT Party. Underwhelmed, I think, would be an accurate characterisation of his response to the 2022 Panadol budget.